Well, thank you, Henry. Thank you all for coming. First, the disclaimer, which is also in the preface of the book. It's easy enough to search online, and Jim Warner knows because he actually paid me way back when. I consult to the RAND Corporation, and I'm explaining to him a little incident that occurred in 2001 that got RAND into a lot of trouble when a researcher did some of his own work, and it led to some international heat. So this is not Jim, and it's not RAND. This is my own personal stuff. As Henry said, there's been persistent myths. These are just two of many examples. This statement from 1976 pretty clearly states the industry view, and not much has changed. 2018. The only updating, of course, is now we have it's a fake story. So you know it's 2018 and not something earlier. Now, some people will say, well, you know, it really doesn't matter. I mean, maybe you can make weapons with reactor-grade plutonium, maybe not. But nobody's ever done that. I mean, everybody's always gone and made weapons-grade plutonium, and that's all anybody's ever going to do. Well,
Greg, just one thing. Let's not assume people know what the two grades are about. Maybe you need to.
Okay.
Sort of
all right. Weapons, you know, when uranium's irradiated in a reactor, it's converted into plutonium, in particular plutonium-239. As the plutonium sits in the reactor, some of it gets converted into higher isotopes, especially 240. When you do make it for weapons, you generally try to reduce the irradiation so the 240 content's low. In a power reactor, you're trying to get as much energy out as possible, so you tend to leave it in longer, and there tend to be higher isotopes. So, well, this was true in the past, and in fact, as I say in the book, in some sense, countries didn't have any choice but to make weapons-grade plutonium because they couldn't make reactor-grade plutonium back in the 50s. But today, you know, that path is kind of rough. Syria found that out in 2007. Their plutonium production reactor was bombed. Repeated Iranian efforts starting in 1991 to get a plutonium production reactor have been thwarted over the years. In contrast, if you've got the money, there are a lot of reactor vendors that'll build you a power reactor. Even Iran, you know, with Bushehr, turns out 1/4 metric ton of plutonium every year. Barely mentioned in the Iran nuclear deal, which may or may not exist anymore. India, in fact, could well be using reactor-grade plutonium in its weapons right now. Certainly in the past, both Sweden and Pakistan considered using reactor-grade plutonium for their weapons, though for other reasons not related to the the properties of the plutonium, they wound up not doing so. And this is still a continuing issue. There's still a push to separate the plutonium from spent fuel, recycle the spent fuel. The most obvious example is Japan, which has an almost 10 metric ton stockpile of separated plutonium. Question is why? Why is there such an interest to plutonium recycle? Well, the dream has been the plutonium breeder reactor. Now, it turns out the way the physics works out, if you use a plutonium-fueled reactor, you can extract substantially more energy from the uranium than the sort of reactors we use today, perhaps by as much as a factor of 100. This has always had great appeal, and this has always been the dream. Now, it turns out breeder reactors aren't very easy to develop. They're at least 40 years behind schedule, and even the Japanese are saying, well, maybe beyond 2050 we'll be able to get such a thing. Now, one argument that comes up with a lot and still occurs is, well, if nuclear power is going to be sustainable, we need to have breeder reactors. Now, in fact, uranium resources have been no constraint on nuclear power development. Nobody's ever said, well, gee, I'd like to buy a reactor, but I'm afraid there won't be the uranium for it. In fact, though there have been ups and downs, the real price in uranium hasn't changed in 50 years. And nuclear power itself these days is facing a rather uncertain future with competition from renewables and natural gas. Now, to get just a little bit into the physics, I don't want to delve too deeply. What's the difference between the weapons grade and reactor grade? Well, these higher isotopes of plutonium that are in the reactor grade have a significantly higher spontaneous fission rate. This causes more neutrons. The neutrons could cause pre-detonation and lower the yield. In fact, that was the basis from the 1940s of claiming that the reactor-grade plutonium couldn't be used for weapons. A more recent argument is that with current LWRs, the plutonium is also rather hot, hotter than weapons grade, and the heat could cause problem for the high explosives in the weapon, and you couldn't use it. Now, one of the problems with this argument is that of the 270 metric tons of plutonium that's already been separated worldwide, most of it isn't anywhere near this hot. So this is always some sort of hypothetical future plutonium. And even then, as I'll indicate, you'll be able to use this plutonium in weapons if you wanted to. The Japanese bring up the reactor-grade plutonium has a higher gamma radiation output. Again, this is no real problem for any country that doesn't follow U.S. radiation standards. And also, as I'll indicate, it's pretty easy to shield against. There's been ongoing debate for way back when. Some work I was involved with in 1976 at a place called Pan-Heuristics prodded the U.S. government into admitting for the first time publicly that reactor-grade plutonium, in fact, could be used to produce nuclear weapons. And in 1977, it went further and revealed that in 1962, it had actually conducted a nuclear test using reactor-grade plutonium. However, the briefing was never formally published, and the U.S. never revealed what the plutonium-240 content of the 1962 test was. This has allowed the nuclear industry to continue to dispute these facts. They've claimed falsely that the test in '62 was not reactor-grade plutonium, and have often resorted to these more ad hominem sort of arguments against those people like myself. And classification has tended to make it difficult for the U.S. experts who really know to weigh in on this subject. Now, again, it's in the book, using reactor-grade plutonium for weapons is actually pretty easy. If you reduce the mass of the plutonium, you can reduce its pre-detonation probability. In fact, you can make it just the same as that of a weapon manufactured with weapons-grade plutonium. With the reduced plutonium mass, it's not hard to handle the heat. You can also put a thin coating, like 1/5 of an inch, 1/2 centimeter, on the core, which could act as part of the tamper. The radiation is weak and easily shielded, so this thin uranium coating would reduce the gamma radiation to significantly less than that of the weapon-grade plutonium. Now, by reducing the mass, you reduce the yield of what you get, but you'd get a lethal area at least 40% and maybe more like 2/3 that of a weapons-grade plutonium weapon, which is still quite sizable. And in fact, as I discuss in chapter 8 in the book, the 1962 test did in fact use reactor grade, what's considered reactor grade today, with this high plutonium-240 content. Also, thanks to North Korea, we now no longer think of boosting technology as something exotic and far away for early nuclear powers. There's some talk that North Korea tested a boosted weapon back in 2016. And if that's the case, then boosting technology may be becoming much more widespread, and for those sorts of weapons, it doesn't matter whether you use weapons-grade or reactor-grade plutonium. Now, part of the problem with the discussion is that people still assume that any country's first nuclear weapon has to be Fat Man. Fat Man was the weapon we tested in 1945 in New Mexico and dropped on Nagasaki a few weeks later. It was a large weapon, 5 feet in diameter, thick amounts of high explosive, a more advanced but still quite primitive weapon, as significantly less sensitive to the properties of reactor-grade plutonium, uses much thinner amounts of HEU, assembles faster, so these stray neutrons have less time to cause problem. And thanks to Prime Minister Netanyahu, we have this latest example of what Iran was thinking of doing. That's Shahab 3, so with that knowledge, you can figure out that the weapon there is only about 2 feet in diameter. And again, this was what Iran was planning to build as its first weapon in 2003. Now, why does all this matter? As I said, Japan already has a 10 metric ton stockpile of this. They're planning to open a plant that would add 8 metric tons per year to this stockpile. Both China and South Korea are angling to emulate Japan. The issue is coming up, nuclear cooperation agreements with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Henry mentioned. Even the Iran nuclear deal was focused solely on weapons-grade plutonium. It assumed that that was the only worry. It was okay for Iraq or Bushehr to produce reactor-grade plutonium and permitted separated plutonium after 2030. So what's the bottom line? Basically, we need to be just concerned about reactor-grade plutonium as weapons-grade. Separated plutonium can be converted into nuclear weapons cores in just days or weeks. It's difficult for the U.S. to react in such a short time. And so the policy implication is the U.S. needs to prevent and eliminate separated plutonium stocks in any non-nuclear weapon state. Thank you.